TopMedTalk.
Well, hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. We're coming to you live from Anesthesiology 2025, the annual meeting of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. We're here in fabulous Antonio, Texas, and we're lucky enough to continue with a new item on TopMedTalk, Perioperative Profiles. Or might it be Periop Profiles, Andy?
We'll let both go, but I think Periop Profiles, yeah.
We love alliteration here at TopMedTalk. So we're so privileged to have Dr. Stephen Shafer as our guest for this perioperative profile. Welcome, Steve.
Welcome, and it's really a pleasure to be here, Kate.
Steve is one of the absolute giants of anesthesia. He has been so instrumental in depth of anesthesia and pharmacokinetics, and he was recently honoured by the ASA for his work rejuvenating and uplifting, I might say, ASA monitor. So, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am currently a farmer in Port Angeles, Washington, where we have 14 acres, and I've basically renovated a farmhouse, which is a wonderful way to lose your retirement savings. And we have cows grazing there. I discovered a few days ago that we have some raccoons on the property. And we put in a golf course, only 6 holes, and it's par 400.
There you go. I'll be over right away.
Yes. So that's what I'm spending some time on these days. Yeah. I'm originally a native of Southern California, grew up in the city of Pasadena. I'm actually a second-generation Californian. There aren't a lot of us. I went to high school across the street from Caltech, which left me very disappointed. I never met Richard Feynman there. I then went from there to Princeton, took 2 years off from Princeton to start a software company. Oh, by far the highlight of my college career was my 2 years away. And then I went to Stanford Medical School and worked with a fellow named Don Stansky as a medical student and did the programming for Don's EEG work and became fascinated with the possibility of using computers in medicine. I had planned to go into private practice, but I went to Penn for my anesthesia training, came back to Stanford for clinical pharmacology with Don, and the whole idea was to find a good job in the Bay Area in private practice.
Why did you want to be in private practice? You seem to be the antithesis of the typical private practitioner.
Because my whole reason to go into medicine was my pediatrician. I had a wonderful pediatrician who I idolized, and he was in private practice, but he also spent half the year on the good ship Hope going around the world. I said, man, he knows everything. That's my pediatrician. He's so respected. He's such a good person, and he does all this volunteer work. And that was still kind of my ideal. But Don hooked me on a career in academics. Right. And so I didn't achieve, that's one of my many unachieved goals.
So how do you jump from software to a medicine degree?
Well, my application to Stanford Medical School, I prepared on a line printer that would actually perfectly adjust all of the margins. And it obviously was done by computer. And it all talked about computers in medicine. And this is back in 1978. And I had a lot of ideas at the time for where it would go. My interest has been in computer software ever since starting a software company back in college. And I continued with that. I eventually sold it, another one of my unsuccessful ventures, and went on to medical school.
And then, so starting medical school, always planning to be an anesthesiologist? Or?
No, I was going to be a pediatrician. Keep in mind, I had this great pediatrician, Dr. Emeritus.
Yeah, I was about to say, yes.
I was going to be a pediatrician. What I discovered, as do so many medical students, is that screaming kids are hard to deal with and screaming parents are worse. And so I came home every day for my pediatrics rotation with a migraine. And I said to my then wife, I said, I can't do this. It's just too difficult to deal with screaming kids. I like procedures. I enjoyed surgery a lot and gave serious thought to surgery. But I figured that I wasn't probably tall enough to reach the top of the operating field. And so I went into anesthesia.
Wow. And which subspecialties of anesthesia did you practice during your career?
Very few. So my real focus has been research. So I was a generalist at Stanford the whole time.
Yeah.
Which is really a specialty of exclusion. So I didn't do open heart surgery. I decided as a resident, I had too many people die and I didn't like people dying during my cases. So I didn't do open heart surgery on bypass cases. Yeah. And I don't do kids because I spent 20 years at the Veterans Hospital and I would rather anesthetize a Martian than a child. So otherwise, I was a generalist. For a while, I was specializing in regional anesthesia, but they kept asking me to do blocks I had never heard of. And I was busted by patients looking at YouTube prior to their procedure.
Yeah. So getting back to your research career, Don Stansky was a great influence on your career, wasn't he? Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, I really kind of owe everything to Don. Don Stansky, one of the real innovators in clinical pharmacology in anesthesia, he trained at UCSF with Lou Scheiner, who you knew. And the UCSF group was really where almost all of modern clinical pharmacology was developed at UCSF. And that's where Don Stansky trained. So he brought to Stanford this whole idea of using the EEG as a way of looking inside the brain and looking at the drug kind of coming on during anesthesia and trying to understand the timing of all of these drugs combined with very invasive and intensive sampling of things like arterial blood. And eventually we were looking at mixed venous blood and all kinds of stuff. And when I was a medical student, I spent a year writing the EEG software for Don. And Don just thought this is something a medical student does. And so my name doesn't appear in any way, shape, or form on those early papers of Don's. I think Don eventually felt guilty that he hadn't given me any credit for writing the EEG software because I like to program. It's a fun thing to do. And so at the end of my anesthesia residency, I said, I want to come back and do a fellowship. And Don said, great. And as my mentor, he was perfect. He brought me into a lab that was up and running, so I didn't have to build my own laboratory. He then brought me fellows who were my fellows very early on. That just doesn't happen. And then as I would write these papers, he didn't put his name on them. Don could have had his name on all of my papers. The first couple papers, I'm the first author with Don or somebody else. But after about 1 year, all of a sudden, I'm the senior author with my own papers. You just don't see mentors show that degree of generosity. And then Don did something wonderful for me, which is he became department chair, which means he left the lab entirely. And the entire apparatus of doing all these studies, Don put in my hands. So without having to build a lab from scratch, I suddenly found myself in this position where I had all these resources and companies bringing studies and things like this. I don't know anybody who had a better mentorship experience than I had with Don. And I've tried to emulate it with my own fellows. I really owe Don thanks for my whole academic career. And we are still in touch.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes.
Well, two of your most famous fellows, Minto and Schneider, and I'm always telling my residents it's Schneider, not Schneider. It's Schneider.
Right.
So they showed up at your lab and, they became very firm friends. We saw them on Friday at this meeting. They even look alike now, which is very strange. Tell me about their arrival and that pivotal work on TCI.
Well, so my first fellow was a guy named John Varvel. And John was the first author of probably my most popular paper,
very famous,
which is Rational Opioid Selection. And John was really talented at math. And I was not a math major. I like math, but it wasn't a math major. John was really deep understanding of mathematics. Came from UC San Diego at the recommendation of Larry Saitman. And we worked together for 2 years, and he was offered an assistant professorship at Stanford, and he went into private practice and broke my heart. But wonderful guy and just unbelievably brilliant. So when he left, I had several other fellows come in, one being Orlando Hung, who you probably know from his work now on airway management and things like this, but very prominent Canadian anesthesiologist. Pierre Facette, who was the president of the Canadian Society, was a fellow for 2 years. Talmadge Egan was a fellow at that time also, and Talmadge now the head of anesthesia at UT, University of Utah. But then these two guys came from abroad, Charles Minto arriving from New Zealand, and Thomas Schneider arriving from basically Switzerland. I think he was in Bern at the time when he came over. And very hardworking and really interested also in sort of experiencing life in the Bay Area. And very different from Charles, who came from a very rural environment in New Zealand, and Tom Schneider came from this very sort of sophisticated European environment, which is also not San Francisco and Palo Alto. And they just dove into things, and they hit it off incredibly well. They would put their heads together, and they kind of became Schminto,
Well, they said on Friday that they needed to put both their heads together to be half as smart as you, Steve.
Yes, that shows that they never really got their act together because individually they are far greater. But they're still working this out. But they were so good. And we happened to have two high impact studies going on. The first one was the study on propofol that was used for the propofol package insert. It became the Schneider pharmacokinetic data set in propofol. And that was ongoing. No, I stand corrected. The first one was remifentanil. First study in man, GI 87046B, I think was the number. First studies of this new Glaxo ester opioid that everybody was talking about. And we went to Glaxo, we put together a whole program of how we could use our high resolution EEG monitoring, arterial blood sampling, and crazy doses, which went up to 8 milligrams per kilogram.
Wow.
That's a lot. So
In 85-year-old patients.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what
massive
target
doses.
would that be in mics per mil? 15 or
It was
something?
huge.
They wouldn't have been breathing very often.
All of our patients in these studies, not just remifentanil, but the ones that preceded it, which were a half dozen or more opioids, they all got succinylcholine. Because otherwise, they just turn to rocks, and you can't ventilate them at all. So we gave these massive doses, but that's what it takes to get a clear EEG signal, is an enormous amount of opioids. You get this enormous increase in power all over the delta bands. So you get a decrease in the overall frequency spectrum, but massive rise in power in the delta bands. And that's what gave us insight into what's going on in the brain with these drugs. And so Charles was doing this study. Thomas arrived, he said, here, helped Charles. He had started, I think, 6 months earlier or so. And then we got this big propofol study. And the reason we got the big propofol study is AstraZeneca had never done a high-resolution PK/PD study like we proposed to them that they needed to do. So they did that study, and that became that data set. And those have become sort of two kind of canonical data sets.
They have.
An H-index of nearly 80 and nearly 30,000 citations. Are they the studies and work that you're most proud of? Are there other projects that you want to highlight? And
Well, from that, life has episodes. And this was my episode back during a period of real innovation in anesthetic pharmacology. And we had all these new drugs coming in. And that period was exciting to do, and I am proud of those papers. Those papers are highly cited papers, and they're consequential papers. Those papers really drove the label. They drove all of the subsequent TCI other than specifically the dip diffuser, because that used a kinetic set that had issues. But it did a lot of innovation, and it really drove those careers for Thomas Schneider, who then went on shortly after he left Stanford to become the head of anesthesia at St. Gallen in Switzerland. And Charles Minto went back and got his PhD. And it was one thing that I take a great deal of pride in is that my name is not known with any of those papers. It's the Minto kinetics. It's the Schneider kinetics. There are actually 2 or 3 different Minto models, including models for KE0 and 3-dimensional surfaces with Tim Short and others. And they're all first author, but I am essentially invisible because I was trying to do what Dawn did for me, which was to use this to enhance these careers. So I'm proud of the experience for the fellows. I'm proud of the work that we did, but it was really hard. And I talked to them afterwards. We went out to dinner after the meeting on Friday. And I said, you know, as exciting, and you kind of look back with kind of rose-colored glasses, say, oh, wasn't it all great? But it was so hard. You know, sleeping, you've lived this life, getting 4 hours of sleep every night. You're in the operating room, and then you put the kids to bed for a couple hours, and then you're up till midnight working on stuff, and up again at 4 o'clock the next morning to get into the lab before you have to go to the OR. It's hard. So I wouldn't do it again.
well, so there's a few things to pick up on there. Firstly, it's amazing that you're most proud of things that you're proud of being invisible on. I mean, that's in itself quite astounding.
Well, I'm proud of that.
Which is great. And then the second...
But I'm proud to be proud of being invisible.
Yeah, sure. But I think that's unusual. But and then the second thing is, as you say, it's and we've seen this on the other Perioperative Profiles we've done with some other speakers, but it's very easy for people to be seen for their achievements. But what people outside don't see is the things that haven't gone so well, or if you like, the failures or the challenges. And are there any of those that you're prepared to share with people?
You obviously missed the lecture that I gave an hour ago, but I outlined my few academic successes, which include work that we did on remifentanil, work we did on dexmedetomidine, because it was Mervyn Mays came up with it. We did the first studies in man at Stanford on dexmedetomidine, and our work with propofol. I said, these are the successes. I then had a list of like 15 drugs where the studies worked. Technically, what we did was correct, but those drugs all failed. I then presented work from a company that I founded in 2003 because I was tired of doing studies for drugs that failed for others. I thought I might as well do studies for drugs that fail for myself. And that added another set of drugs to the list of failures. And then at that same time, I worked on something called sedasis, which failed, which was then followed by work that I'm doing since then, which is mostly failed. And so when you ask about failures, I'd rather talk about successes because it's a shorter list.
Fair enough. And I think, so we can talk more about the challenges and the failures, but I wanted to pick up on the other thing you just mentioned about kids. And that's the other thing that I think people often brush over, but there's clearly a family life going on in the background of all this amazing work, but successes. But I mean, how does that fit in and how do you make that work?
It's very difficult. And I think that my dedication to trying to build an academic career, trying to bring in the money, when sort of in the mid-1990s, we had about 15 people in the lab. We had multiple studies going all the time. I'm not only trying to do the scientific part and help with the papers and all this, but I'm also trying to recruit the studies and get the funding for everything, keep the whole thing going. And I think that is what led to my actually eventually divorcing Audrey Shafer, my first wife, a profoundly brilliant clinician. She has her own academic career, which has gone exceptionally well. But the toll that it takes, there's only 24 hours in any of our days. And I think that my single-mindedness in trying to develop an academic career took its toll on my marriage. Now I'm close with my kids, which is great, and she is too. And she and I continue to interact on a number of things involving kids and grandkids. Balance is extremely difficult. She's an anesthesiologist on faculty at Stanford. I then married my current wife, Pamela Flood, who's wonderful. And Pamela was at Columbia, so I had to go to Columbia for a couple of years to prove that I loved her. And then I dragged her back to Stanford with Audrey's permission. Audrey and Pamela were both at Stanford together, which made everybody uncomfortable, but it shows the generosity of spirit on Audrey's part to say this is what would be good for my ex-husband. And she's very happily married too, I should add.
So moving on to, from the Paleolithic period to the next era, you became the editor-in-chief of Anesthesia and Analgesia, and you did that for about 10 years?
Exactly 10.
And that was a high point in the life of that journal. Can you tell us how you got involved in that and then what you think you achieved?
Yeah, well, when I applied to be the editor-in-chief of Anesthesia and Analgesia, I had never submitted a paper. My view was that if it wasn't good enough for anesthesiology, I wasn't going to publish it. And Anesthesia and Analgesia at that time had the rather racist moniker of the Yellow Peril. I don't know if you remember that or not, but really...
It had a yellow cover.
It had a yellow cover, and it was not well thought of at all. And so at the time, I was on the editorial board of anesthesiology, and editors of anesthesiology had always been chosen from members of the current editorial board. And they had sort of voted and selected one. And so I put my name in to be the editor-in-chief of anesthesiology. Jim Eisenack came out as a visiting professor at Stanford. And Jim had stepped down as an editor, but he told me, by the way, one of the things I want to do is to put my name as the editor-in-chief of anesthesiology. And I said, oh, well, I'd vote for you. I mean, I put my name in too, but you're better qualified. You're the better person for the job. You've got a long history of R01 research grants, which is what they're looking for. You get my vote. So I'm not going to put my name in. Several people on the ANA search committee reached out to me. So having never published a paper in ANA, I put my name in and got the position. So ANA had a lot of problems at the time. There were problems with the quality of peer review. There were problems with the processing of manuscripts. There were even serious financial problems. Their financial model was totally dependent on reprints, primarily aprotein reprints, actually. And I said, these things are all serious issues. started the task of being editor-in-chief and handling all the papers the same day, actually, that my mother died, which made things kind of difficult. And within not too long, I discovered that there were a number of problems with things that had appeared in the pages of ANA in the past that I had to address. And that will probably lead into your next question.
Well, I remember being at a meeting with you in Adelaide where you said that anesthesia and analgesia leads in publishing fraudulent research. Do you remember that? We were in the Barossa Valley. So there were a couple of naughty anaesthetists that you and your team, and in fact, your wife, Dr. Flood, uncovered. Would you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So the first big one was Scott Rubin. And Scott Rubin had done all his work in celecoxib and perioperative pain management following orthopedic surgery and things like this. And I got a call from Bay State where he was saying, we have evidence, we have concern that these papers are fraudulent. So we had several papers that were in press that I said, okay, those are not going to go forward. And a couple of papers in review that I put on hold. And meanwhile, I was attending a lecture by actually Gene Viscusi, who's here at this meeting, talking about how great celecoxib and related drugs are, citing paper after paper by Scott Rubin. And I was going, not so fast. So a couple days after that, I received a note from Bay State. They have found evidence of fraud in some papers. So what we did, but they wouldn't tell anybody what the papers were. But by contacting other journals and kind of putting together sort of a network analysis of papers, we came up with a list of 21 papers, which I published in ANA, and immediately phoned a guy named Adam Marcus. And Adam Marcus was the editor of Anesthesiology News, which is actually now our big competitor at the ASA Monitor. But anyway, Adam Marcus was the editor of Anesthesiology News because I knew that he could tell people through the presence of Anesthesiology News what these fraudulent papers were, because people need to know. If a paper is known to be fraudulent, you've got to get that out as fast as possible as an obligation to readers and as an obligation to the clinical community, because people are making clinical decisions. So Adam got that out there, and that was the first big case. But then I had several smaller cases come up where there were evidence of various kinds of fraud and plagiarism and things like this. But the next big one was Bolt. And Joachim Bolt sent a paper in, and we published it in 2009. And that paper they gave people something called Hesband, just a starch solution as a volume replacement in place of blood, or albumin. And Joachim Bolt had received tons of money from the two big German companies that make hydroxyethyl starch. So he sent this paper in showing that in cardiopulmonary bypass, your levels of IL-6, if you got hydroxyethyl starch, were just nothing bad happened. But if you got albumin, your IL-6 went off the wall. Huge concentrations of IL-6. And within 3 weeks of publishing it, I received 3 letters from separate people saying the IL-6 is wrong because the assay for IL-6, just the controls that you get when you set up the assay kit, the standard deviation is less than he shows. And that's what the kit that comes with the assay, your controls. And it turns out then my wife saw this, Pamela, and she said, I'm running that assay in the lab. And that's correct. I can't reproduce these data with the control samples that I get for the assay. One of the papers came from the company that made the drug.
What?
They didn't fund the study, but they looked at it. They said, we've been hoping that our drug would be better in cardiovascular surgery, but we've done this study ourselves and it doesn't look like this. We think the study might be fraudulent. That was from the company that made the drug that he said was working well.
Good for them.
So I sent Bolt letters. I thought he would write back and say, oh, this is not standard deviations. This is a standard error of the mean. Some simple explanation like that. I say, okay, fine. No answer. Months went by. No answer. Then he made a incredible mistake. He sent us another paper to Anesthesia and Analgesia for publication. I wrote back to him. I said, thank you for sending these papers. What about this paper that people allege is fraudulent? And we had a back and forth that got increasingly angry. So I called it the place he worked because he was a private practice guy. He was not in an academic institution. And I called up the head of the whole Klinikum Ludwigshafen. And I said, we've got a problem here, and this guy Bolt's not working with me, and I'm concerned because there's been allegations of fraud, and he just won't talk to me. I said, who looks after responsible and ethical conduct of research? And he said, each investigator looks after his own. I said, oh, that doesn't sound too good. So, can you imagine a bank going to a bank and saying, who looks after banking fraud? They say, oh, each bank looks after their own. Don't worry about it. So eventually I was able to find out by talking to other editors-in-chief of anesthesia journals that it looked like the local medical society where he was in Rhineland-Pfalz were responsible for his IRB approval. So I contacted them and I say, I have concerns. They said, well, we don't really do this. We don't know. Do you do his IRB approvals? Yes, we do his IRB approvals because he's a private practice, so that comes to us. And the folks there, Plur and Hoffert, I think they never really wanted to thank me for this because they got into it and they invited Bolt for some interviews and stuff like that. And they decided that it was all fake. It was all fraudulent. And not just this study, but decades of research might be fraudulent. Bolt is now at the top of the retraction watch leaderboard for retractions. I think he has over 200 retractions, including some retractions of PhD theses where he was the mentor of several people. And then he published the dissertations from Gießen University after they had left. And the publications, Gießen looked into it and found that even the PhD theses were fraudulent. So we had
conspiracy of silence.
Yes, and it wasn't just him. He was the head of an anesthesia and critical care clinic in Ludwigshafen. The previous year, he had been the president of the DGAI, which is sort of like the Deutsche Grammophon Anesthesia Institute, but it doesn't actually mean that. But something like that. It's like the German ASA. He was actually the president of that the year before, and they gave me an award for my work at ANA, and I couldn't attend because of conflicts. But if I had, Bolt would have given me my award.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, the thing is that he was incredibly prominent and had placed himself where he could not be touched unless it came from the outside. And everybody who was working in his department was in on it. And a massive number of retractions. It took about 2 years off of my life. The head of the clinic in Ludwigshafen said each investigator locates himself. He was fired. Bolt's office was locked up, and a Dr. Radke came in, who's a German anesthesiologist, by clinic in Ludwigshafen to try to clean it all up. And he went through all of these notebooks and computers and everything like that, and he said, nothing. Just,
wow.
Invented fraud.
Yeah.
What a tumultuous period of time. I mean,
yeah.
So is that how you go from, I guess, trying to pull all that evidence together and search for the evidence, but to becoming a witness and being the expert witness? And I've got to ask about the Michael Jackson case.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that too. So, by the way, what's sad from a personal perspective is, a lifetime of trying to do research in drug development with very few successes, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
And all of this work in pharmacokinetics where we have been successful doing kinetic analysis. I mean, the actual studies worked. It's just the drugs failed. But the studies all worked. But all of this work that I've tried to do in that mathematical modeling of things, and I'm known for academic misconduct and the death of Michael Jackson, which isn't really what people aspire to at the end of an academic career.
But equally, not many people are proud of being invisible.
Well, this is why, because otherwise they say, well, that's the guy that's death of Michael Jackson. It pays to be invisible.
So I've got to ask about the story. So go and tell us, how did you get involved in that case? It shouldn't be the big thing you're famous for, but you were involved in it. What was the journey like?
It was very interesting and sad in a bunch of ways, and also quite terrifying. So I had been contacted by the people involved in the civil suit. There was a criminal case against Conrad Murray, and there was a civil suit by the family against the company that was doing the production of the Michael Jackson Las Vegas tour thing that he was planning on going and was preparing for at the time. So I had seen all of the records that were prepared by the Los Angeles coroner. I had seen the medical records and all of this stuff. I had seen the analysis by a woman named Selma Combs, who is brilliant and fabulous. And she was the coroner's go-to person for anything involving an anesthetic drug. And she nailed it. She completely got it right. And so I said, propofol overdose by somebody who didn't know what they were doing. This is not ambiguous. It's clear. I then got a call from a guy named David Walgren. David Walgren was the district attorney, but if you Google David Walgren, you'll see that he looks like he should be a Hollywood movie star cast as a district attorney. I mean, he's this very good-looking guy and, with wonderful dentistry and just looks the movie star part. But he's a very skilled and dedicated attorney as well. But the first time I met him, I was like, "Hi, I'm Steve Shafer. I know you say you're David Walgren, but can I actually meet the real David Walgren? It can't possibly be you. You might be Brad Pitt, but you're not David Walgren." But anyway, so David called me a month before it was scheduled to go to trial in 2011. And he said, "Our anesthesia expert doesn't seem to know what they're talking about. And somebody in private practice they found, and I have no idea. The name didn't mean anything to me. But they said that the defense is alleging that Michael Jackson drank the propofol that killed him." And I actually started to laugh on the phone. I said, "There aren't many drugs on the anesthesia cart you could safely drink, but propofol's one of them. And so you could drink the whole bottle of propofol and nothing would happen to you. And the reason is because it all goes through the liver."
We should just stick a disclaimer in here on TopMedTalk. Do not go and try this at home before you put that's fine. But yeah, okay.
I would not. You can probably do it safely. It won't help your salad. It's a little bit like a sort of an off salad dressing. But the thing is that the liver is like the Roach Motel. The propofol checks in and it never leaves. The liver has such enormous capacity to metabolize propofol that everything, of course, that goes into your stomach and intestines all goes through the liver. No propofol leaves the liver. And that's why you can actually do this. Like I say, don't do this with any drugs you find in the anesthesia cart. But if you're only having one. So he said this, and I said, that's impossible. Propofol can't possibly have caused death by drinking it. IV is another story. And then he said, well, their expert is Paul White. And my heart just sunk. I knew Paul. He was on the editorial board of Anesthesiology. He had been at Stanford where I was a medical student. My first wife, Audrey, did her fellowship with Paul White. But Paul was always a little bit less than rigorous with data sometimes. And I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe Paul would actually claim that Michael Jackson died from drinking propofol. If he just looked at the pharmacokinetics, he would know that's impossible because the clearance of propofol exceeds hepatic blood flow. It's just not possible that it could happen. So anyway, they postponed the trial because they said, we have new evidence, Stephen Shafer, and he says that you can't drink propofol. So they said, we're going to prove you can. So they said, we're doing a study in pigs to show it over the summer because we had a 3-month extension so the defense could prepare for having their initial plan, which is say Michael Jackson drank the propofol, they were prepared to counter that. So they did a pig study. In the meantime, I went into the OR with my wife, Pamela, and I grabbed a 20 cc syringe of propofol, and Pamela was there just in case I was wrong, but I wasn't. And I drank it, and literally nothing happens. It doesn't do anything. So what we did then, because the judge said, well, and I said, I'm not drinking propofol on the witness stand. I mean, anesthesiologists abusing drugs is actually a very serious problem. And to have an anesthesiologist show up on national television and drink propofol is really a bad idea. We're not going there.
And it was all televised.
Oh, the trial was televised. So what happened then, 6 anesthesiologists in Chile, all good friends, including Ignacio Cortinas, who you probably know, and Pablo Sepulveda, this great group of Chilean anesthesiologists. The 6 of them got together, and I called them. I said, can you do a study? Because at Stanford, going through IRB and everything, no way I'd get this approved. They said, we can probably get through our IRB and do this all, by the book. So they did. And in 1 month, they got through the IRB. They put 8 arterial lines in each other. They drank 50 mils each of propofol, not simultaneously. And they had pulse ox and everything like this. And nothing but nothing. No drug shows up in the circulation. So then we took that to the judge, and the judge said, well, it's not been published anywhere. So at the last second, I submitted it to the International Society of Anesthetic Pharmacology, where it appeared as an abstract. And the judge said, it's now been published as an abstract. We will accept this as evidence. And literally the next sentence in the courtroom, this is all pre-trial, so it's not televised. The next sentence from the defense attorney is, we are withdrawing our objection to the propofol data. We will not be making any claim about drinking propofol. The defense, they knew they lost on the science. And so they completely walked that back. And they came up with an opinion that Michael Jackson killed himself by self-injecting 25 milligrams of propofol. That's 2.5 cc's of propofol. That was fatal. And what Paul White said on the witness stand, it was fatal because it was combined with lidocaine and it was combined with a benzodiazepine. And when you combine propofol with lidocaine and a benzodiazepine, it's, the potential lethality is there, and that's what killed him. And the jury the jury did not buy it. The jury said, no, Condon is guilty of manslaughter. But to tell an anesthesiologist that 2.5 cc's of propofol is dangerous because it's combined with lidocaine and a benzo, which is what everybody does every day.
Yeah.
That's how we always give propofol.
And what was it like to be an international television star?
It was weird. Would go out to restaurants and people would recognize me, which, only lasted about, 45 seconds. But people would say, oh yeah, I see you here going through security at the airport and things like that. But my favorite aspect of it was I would walk out of the courtroom and I'd be followed by news crews. So in the court, Paul White referred to me as a scumbag. You can still find this online. Look up Shafer scumbag. You'll still find this. So he called me a scumbag, and this got the judge was told this by people who were in the sort of the visitors gallery to watch the proceedings, where Paul watched the whole thing unfold, and he referred to me as a scumbag, and this got back to the judge, and the judge cited Paul for contempt of court for doing that. But having said that, I was in the Justice Building, kind of watching all of this and talking to David Walgren and others. I made up a little name tag for myself that said scumbag. And I wore this, and everybody thought it was very funny, and I completely forgot about it. So I walked out the next day after Paul had been cited for contempt of court, and this was all on the news and stuff, that I was a scumbag. I walked out wearing a name tag that said scumbag, and I'm followed by news crews saying, Dr. Shafer, and they said, don't talk, don't engage, don't talk, just keep walking, don't engage, don't talk. So finally they all leave me, and I looked down and I'm still wearing the scumbag. So that story doesn't end there. In Port Angeles, we have some very good friends who are associated with TV news. And at the time, they remember following the trial and looking at footage and stuff for one of the television stations in Colorado. And he said that he saw this footage come in and nobody ran it. But he looked at it, he remembers, he was going, I think it says scumbag on his suit.
Steve, thank you. Absolute pleasure. And as always, thank you to Kate for sharing this with us. It's a huge pleasure to say thank you very much for sharing your Periop profile here on TopMedTalk.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm very honored by the invitation. So thank you.
Thank you. TopMedTalk. So as always, you can listen to this and all of the podcasts on our website on topmedtalk.com. You'll find us on your podcaster of choice, whatever that is, whether that's Apple, Spotify, we're on them all. Do find us on social media. You'll find us on all the main social media channels. Hit like, hit subscribe, makes a massive difference to us at this end. And of course, a huge thank you to our sponsors. That's BD and GE this year. And of course, thank you very much to the ASA for hosting us.